Over the past couple of years in Boston, there's been a surge of housing production, but also worries about cost. Our guest has been following the story and keeping an eye on how to solve the housing problem with housing growth. We'd like to welcome a columnist for the Boston Globe, Dante Ramos. Thank you very much for being with us.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Your most recent column on this was about the laws of physics in housing and how much we're defying that. So what does that mean?
What it means is that in Boston, we have a lot of people who are looking for housing, students, working people, people up and down the spectrum who are looking for housing, looking for a place to live. We have a lot of people who are moving here from all over the country who are looking for jobs in our hospitals and our universities, and we have a fairly static amount of housing units. It's very difficult to build things here, partly because it's just a very dense place, partly because, neighbors get involved in every aspect of the decision. It's just really difficult and expensive to build stuff. And so as a result, there's a lot of people who want to live here, a lot of people who are already living here, and there's just not enough housing. And that is bound to make prices go up. As sure as the law of gravity makes, an apple fall on Isaac Newton's head, if there's a lot of people who are pushing for a scarce resource like housing, the prices are going to go up, and we have to remedy that.
Well, in Boston, as you know, there are people who put up complaints about developments. They say, well, you need more parking spaces, or there's just too much height here. How do you alleviate some of those concerns without choking the supply?
I think it's really hard to do, and I don't mean to be too libertarian about it, but I think that a lot of the well-meaning controls that people put on in terms of parking space, in terms of height, are things that really do, as you said, end up strangling supply. And people could probably put up with a few, neighbors could put up with slightly fewer parking spaces, could put up with an extra couple of stories. And if everybody was willing to do that, and if we all exhaled and said, okay, this isn't that big of a deal, it would go a long way towards building a lot of new housing in the neighborhoods, and not just these high-profile luxury towers that we're all seeing.
Well, one idea that people have been talking about for a while, and I've yet to see somebody actually take the plunge into it, is the graduate student village. Now, on the one hand, it could be a great way to take pressure off the rest of the market, but some other people say, oh, that's a gated community. We don't want that.
It's funny because it used to be, when I was in college in Boston in the late 80s and early 90s, the idea that people had a rat trap apartment or that you lived in suboptimal accommodations wasn't that big of a deal. Lately, we've seen how that can be quite lethal in some of these cases. There was a BU student who died in an illegal apartment, but the idea that housing units have to be, a posh two-bedroom unit for somebody who's in their 20s or, that person and their friend, maybe we've pushed that a little bit too far. And if we could experiment with other forms of housing, one of the things that makes housing expensive to build is not so much the floor space, but the kitchen and the bathroom. And so if you and I and 4 other people were graduate students and we lived on the same floor and we each had our own doors that we could lock, but we shared a kitchen, and maybe each of us had our own small bathroom, that's something that would allow a developer or a university that was building this kind of thing to, to accommodate more of us, but spend, $100,000 less for the 6 of us. And that's the kind of thing that I think we need to explore here in the city. What
about micro-housing? I mean, they've built it, people are buying it, but it's not cheap either.
It's not cheap. It's the same pattern of anything that is new that is built in Boston tends to be very expensive. Again, you have the kitchen and the bathroom problem. So, instead of one bedroom for 800 or one bathroom for 800 square feet, you have one bedroom for 400 square feet. There's a way to squeeze the costs a little bit. People in the architecture and development professions that I talk to say that, there are ways to squeeze the space, there's ways to squeeze the cost, but there's not enough of this activity going on yet. And people are a little bit, it's still an untried model here in Boston. It's something that I think is promising, but has its potential drawbacks too.
Turning to transit-oriented housing, this has been around for a while. People love the concept, but in practice, especially when you talk about the T, you get some problems work out. What do you think needs to be done?
I think in housing in general, we all need to grit our teeth a little bit and realize that the solutions to the problems will require a little bit of sacrifice on everybody's part. What I think that means in practice is that in a place like like on West Broadway in South Boston by the Broadway T-stop, there have been proposals for less parking there and more apartments without a lot of parking. And people get a little bit nervous about that because they feel like it's going to add congestion to the neighborhood. They feel like it'll add congestion to the T. And we all know that the T has had its problems. Maybe I'm too optimistic about this. I tend to think that if there's a big constituency of people using the T, that increases the number of people who can write to their state representative and write to Governor Baker and to all of the powers that be in the state and talk about this need that we have for reliable transit.
This gets very politically colored because right now I can see here, what looks good as far as supply and numbers can mean that you get one bunch of people who want these units, and then you have other people in South Boston. Look, I got kids, I got a van, I got to take them to hockey practice. I need a parking space.
Right. No, look, none of this is easy. What I would ask people to remember is that the fact that you don't build anything new, the fact that you don't change anything, doesn't mean that the situation isn't going to change around you. Boston has undergone, since the recession, an enormous growth. We were one of the few oases in a very bleak national environment during the recession, and we've come out of the recession gangbusters. And so even if people don't want to see a lot of change in their neighborhood, the pressure that is being put to bear on the existing housing stock by the number of people who want to live in this great city of ours means that necessarily the underlying economics are changing, even if we don't agree to do anything about it.
You referenced a recent study from the Joint Center at Harvard, and one of the things that they flagged here, even in addition to the question of supply, is the fact that there's this enormous income gap. There are too many people who just don't make enough money.
It's a big problem. It's a national problem. I would actually argue that, and I'm probably the biggest enthusiast in town for just building. Construction jobs are great jobs. And by choking off the construction industry, that's also limiting the number of jobs that are available to, to people who've done really badly in the current economy. Young men, people without a college education. So having a robust home construction industry solves a couple of those problems. I'm not going to say that it'll solve all of the economic inequalities that exist in our city because I think they're enormous. I do think that by doing nothing, we're not really helping the situation.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
From the Boston Globe, Dante Ramos, and we'll have more news in just a moment.